This conversation is a part of a broader effort to have these types of conversations be taking place here at Duke Divinity School so that we have more awareness of what is going on with our military and our government and how we are connected to that. And so thank you, Matt, for being here also.
Of course.
And I'm glad that she mentioned that you have other avenues of writing. So I'm actually going to dive into something that's sort of difficult to talk about, but you raised in your CBS piece recently about the divide between military and America. So you wrote about the willingness of Americans to support going to war while simultaneously distancing themselves from what happens in war. So basically, many people in America will vote for war, but don't pay attention to the details of what that entails. So essentially, they're willing to send others to war to do the killing instead of doing it themselves. Okay. This is a pretty harsh reality that you speak to. And it seems that your writing can help bridge this divide. You're talking about a divide between Americans and what we are doing in the military. So is this one of the reasons that you write? And then you're also welcome to respond to anything else that you have mentioned here.
Sure. First, thank you so much for being here and being so welcoming. I'm a proud Wake Forest Demon Deacon, but everybody today at Duke has been so welcoming. It's really making me reevaluate many years of awful things I've said about your basketball team. So, the divide that we hear so much about between military and civilian America. I think the percentage is something like 0.5% of Americans serve in our times. What does that look like? Within the military, certainly when I was in, and then even now ongoing, I think we're year 15 of Afghanistan. There's a real sense that you're fighting for country, not with it. On the other side, having been out now longer than I was in uniform, you really have to work to stay not just connected, but even informed with the wars being carried out in our collective name. And I say that because it's important. If you're a taxpayer, which I'm sure it's on everybody's mind right now in tax season, you're part of the war machine. When you're over there as a soldier or Marine, you're not just wearing the unit patch of your unit, you're wearing the American flag, right? They're representing us all. Those 19 and 20-year-old kids being sent overseas now, they're connected to all of us, whether they know it or not, or whether we know it or not. And it's you go back to President Nixon, ending the draft and kind of establishing an all-volunteer force. As a result, kind of a separate warrior caste has kind of come into being. My personal view of it all is, and this is something that's kind of evolved more as a citizen than as a veteran, is that this is a dangerous thing. This is a very unrepublican thing, lowercase republic, right? The history of our country had checks and balances in place to ensure that going to war was the last of all options when all other options had been exhausted, right? So then you draw from the young people in the population to carry that out. It's simply, one example of this is while Congress continues to authorize the funding used to fight ISIS, for example, in northern Iraq and Syria, there's still the last AUMF authorized use of military force that was passed by Congress was 2001 in the aftermath of the attacks of 9/11. That was almost 15 years ago, right? Passed under very different conditions, in an entirely different country with an entirely different foe. You could certainly make the case that Congress has abdicated their responsibility in that regard. But who does Congress report to? Who all of us as citizens. So writing is, I'm a writer. So what do you do? It can be a very small thing, and we're talking these big grand things of profound influence and power and layers of bureaucracy separating us from these institutions. But the alternative is to do nothing, right? And I think I'm preaching to the choir here. They're here here on a nice day to talk about these very serious, heavy issues. So you write and you contribute and you think, and then you just try to encourage other citizens to do the same.
Mm-hmm. And in that same piece, you actually talked about the millennials, and you note that this divide is not along political lines, which I think a lot of people, maybe not those who are here, but a lot of people tend to think this divide is along political lines. Certain people are supporting and understand the military, and certain people don't. But you kind of highlight the millennials, and you basically say that this group, the millennials, they would say, yes, let's go and do combat operations against ISIS, ISIL, Daesh, and yet they're the very same people who say, I will not go and do it myself.
Right.
And so do you think, particularly with this group of people, do you have any ideas, or besides your writing, what other things? I mean, I heard you speak basically about politics and about voting, to become connected to this, to give these millennials some sense of connection to what's actually going on over there.
Right, yeah, no, and I don't even blame the millennials, not just because that makes me sound like an old person, but that's the country they inherited. This is the country we gave our young people, right? Talking to college students, cognitively, all they remember is their country at war. They were maybe 4 or 5 when 9/11 happened. It is the most normal thing in the world for them to turn on the news and see their country bombing some other nation in the name of whatever. We failed the millennials. So yeah, when you see polls that show that nearly 60% of them would never serve in the military, even if they were needed, yet still about the same percentage support combat operations in Syria. That's very dispiriting, but that's not an indictment of them. That's an indictment on us, I think, the rest of us who shepherded them into this reality. Of course they feel disconnected after 15 years of people not necessarily from their world doing these things. And that said, as they come into young adulthood and start taking leadership positions in private and public sectors, I hope they're reading Phil's book, right, and maybe getting kind of a human taste of what war means, not just on individual American souls, but on the lives and communities of Iraqis and Afghans. Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan are not bomb-filled craters, but they're neighborhoods. They're places where people are trying to endure and survive in the midst of all sorts of war and ruin. Literature, I think, is uniquely qualified to kind of bridge that empathy divide, right, and get people, but especially young people, to think about different perspectives and different worldviews. So that's one thing that I hope not just Youngblood, but the emerging Iraq and Afghanistan war literature can do. It's frightening when you talk to college students, and they haven't learned the art of guile yet. I was up at a northeastern school last month, and one raised his hand, and he, in a completely earnest way, with no subtext, the way somebody maybe just a few years older would have it. So why should we care, right? And I was really taken off guard by the directness of it, but also kind of found it refreshing. And I tried to make him care. There's a lot of pressure in the moment, but so I think that's something that all of us who are invested in this subject and these issues of American foreign policy and war and peace and armed conflict, we need, whatever our background, veteran, civilian, professor, barista, whatever. It's up to all of us to get them to care, because this is going to be their country very, very soon, and they're going to be influencing the next generation. And if they don't care, their kids certainly aren't going to either.
Mm-hmm. Well, you do a good job in your writing, which is your forte, at getting people to care. And I think especially through sort of the first-person point of view and the emotions. Would you take some time to read us an excerpt
Sure.
from your book?
Yeah, I'd be happy to.
I think this would be a good time for that.
I'm going to read from the prologue of Youngblood, so shouldn't as it's the prologue, it shouldn't have any introduction necessary. It's strange trying to remember now. Not the war, though that's all tangled up too. I mean the other parts. The way sand pebbles nipped at our faces in the wind. How the mothers glared when we raided houses looking for their sons. The smell of farm animal waste and car exhaust blending together during patrols through town, rambling, aimless hours, lost to the desert. How falafel bits got stuck between my teeth so much I started bringing floss on missions, along with extra ammo and water. The sun, the goddamn heat, the days I couldn't sleep and the nights I wouldn't. How the power of being in charge got to me, how it got to all the officers and sergeants, giant armed soldiers at our backs, ready to carry out foreign policy through sheer fucking force. How sometimes, many times, we were gentle. The feeling of something, relief, gratitude, exhaustion, when a patrol returned to the outpost, and for another day, we'd be able to ask ourselves, just what the hell were we doing? So little of Iraq had anything to do with guns, or bombs, or jihads. That's what people never understand. There was the desert, and the locals, and their lives. The way time could be vague and hazy one moment, yet hard as bone the next. A lot of people ask, what was it like? And once, I even tried to answer. I was home with old friends. They meant well, and while they didn't want a perfect story, they wanted a clean one. It's what everyone wants, and I knew that. But it came out wrong. I started off about imperial grunts walking over a past we didn't know anything about, but I could see their eyes glazing over, so I switched to the Iraqi kids playing in mud under bent utility poles, but that didn't work either. An anecdote about finding an old sheik's porn collection earned some laughs, but by then I'd lost them, so I stopped. What's an imperial grunt? One asked later. They helped the SEALs get bin Laden? Kind of, I said, even though we hadn't. I miss it, which is a funny thing to think, until I remember otherwise. Like the daily purpose. I miss that, as messy as it could be. I miss the clarity of trying to survive. I miss the soldiers. Even miss the Mukhtar, who was honest enough to hate us, but still made us chai, because we were guests. And her, of course. She comes in fragments, slivers of jagged memory that cut and condemn. How she'd sigh before we talked about the past. How my mind ached after we considered the future. I failed Rana. Failed her utterly. All because I tried to help. What was it like? Hell if I know. But next time someone asks, I won't answer straight and clean. I'll answer crooked, and I'll answer long. And when they get confused or angry, I'll smile. Finally, I'll think. Someone who understands. So, hopefully, if nothing else, when people read that, they're like, oh, okay, I'll turn the next page.
Thank you for reading it. If we didn't know better, though, we would think that that's Matt Gallagher speaking.
Right, sure.
How much of this novel, or let's just say your writing,
Mm-hmm.
is you reckoning with the past? How much do you miss the clarity of every day, knowing what you're supposed to do? How much of this is about you trying to figure things out for yourself, having been a soldier yourself on the ground?
Probably more than I think, but less than an average reader. Reckoning with the past, I think, is probably something that a lot of literature does, whether it's related to war or not, right? Certainly, Moby Dick comes to mind, right? That's Ishmael trying to sort out that grand, awful adventure that he'd been a part of. That said, I'd already written a book from the perspective of Matt Gallagher, the memoir Kaboom. It was a micro story about one young person and his platoon. So I didn't, when I set out to write Youngblood, I'd already been shaken out of my own skull, right? I'd already said what I'd seen and done and participated in. In many ways, Kaboom was a story where a lot of things went right, I was there as part of the surge. We came back with a cautious sense of optimism, as quaint as that seems now. We came back thinking we'd won the war, if wars like Iraq can be won, or at least turned a corner. And for some, and it wasn't just fluff. I mean, the town we were in was legitimately more stable than we'd found it 15 months before. There was running water. There was sometimes consistent electricity. There was this sense, though, like, will this last when there aren't armed American soldiers at every corner? We know the answer to that now, but we didn't then. So I started writing Youngblood in the fall of 2011, which is when the American military withdrew from Iraq as a whole. I think for some very obvious reasons, like many veterans and civilians invested in this. I was watching the news because there were these questions of legacy and inheritance, and you devoted 15 months of a formative time of your youth to this time and place. What is that going to mean? Not just for you, but for the Iraqi people, the ones that you knew very well, and their families, who have, for 9 years of a war and occupation, have tried to endure. So I started writing Youngblood with all this kind of in mind. I wanted to, 9 years is a long time, so I knew I couldn't maybe write about the whole war in one novel, but I wanted to get some sense of breadth, some sense of totality. So it's set near that withdrawal, so a few years after I was there. And it started off in third person, because you feel this very writerly pressure of like, well, people will think it's you, so you have to write in third. And the early drafts, while it was helpful as an exercise, it kind of lacked in maybe an emotional texture that I thought that was important to the story. So I switched to first person, and then it's like, okay, so how do you write in first person, not from the perspective of yourself? I'd done some speech writing at that point, so I had some practical experience in doing that. But yeah, it just took a lot of drafts. It started with some very basic stuff as the narrator, Jack Porter, started to formulate. It may seem like small little biographical things, but it was actually hugely important as I developed his character. I'm an older brother. Jack's a younger brother. Very different. And that, I remember calling up my younger brother and saying, I'd like to interview you about being a younger brother. And he's like, so tell me about that. And he's like, well, the mere fact that you're only asking me about this for your freaking book is the first lesson. So I was like, oh, that's very helpful. I was like, yeah, you're right. I'm kind of a jerk. And the older brother in here might be a bit of a jerk as well, at least at points. Jack's an infantry officer, whereas I was a cavalry officer. It may seem like a small cultural thing, but anyone who's spent time in either unit, either type of unit, knows there's a very profound cultural difference. Cav, we're kind of, I don't want to say loosey-goosey, though others would accuse us of that, but we're adaptable. We wear cowboy hats. We're proud of that tradition. Infantry is much more tight-laced, by the book, dress right, dress. So kind of exploring that, and then having it be set a few years after I was there was vital, because I couldn't write from my tiny skulled kingdom, as David Foster Wallace said. I'd do a lot of research, see how the war had changed, how it had evolved, interviewing soldiers, some of my old former soldiers who had gone back during this time frame, reading a lot of great nonfiction and journalism about this time, and one of the most helpful things was reading oral histories about everyday Iraqis, right? I'd certainly had my own experiences, some of them friendly, others not, with Iraqis, and I could have relied on my own experience that way, but at some point I realized every conversation I'd had, I was sitting in their living room with a gun, right? And no matter how much we were smiling and laughing with one another, that conversation was going to be colored by the fact that I was a foreign occupier sitting in their living room, whatever we were talking about. So reading those oral histories, as an American veteran was tough. It was tough because there was a searing forthrightness there that only on rare occasions did I experience personally. in those conversations. But as a writer, it was invaluable because it was very important to me to have full dimensional Iraqi characters in this book. For the reasons we've talked about. This was about them. It's not really about us. As we're seeing play out in 2016, as kind of the war is still going on over there, and now we're I guess it is kind of about us again as we're sending. I think another brigade just got shipped over, but.
So you were talking about relationships and how you did. It's interesting to hear a little bit of sort of your research and preparation for writing the book, because you have such a complexity in the relationships in this book, and these characters. Two main characters, Chambers and Rana. Rana, who, if you couldn't hear it, that was the woman mentioned at the end of the prologue. Could you talk about these two characters, a sergeant and an Iraqi woman who, at face value, we wouldn't think that they have a lot of commonalities. So
right.
I'm asking you to share a little bit what's in your book, but to explain to people here how there are some similarities between the two, and how come you decided to write it this way.
Sure. Yeah, Chambers kind of effectively functions as the antagonist, though he was one of my favorite characters to write. Every villain is the hero of their own story, and Chambers is on his 4th tour. He knows what it takes to survive and endure. His primary goal in life is to get his men home, right? Is to get his soldiers home. That is the compromise he's made. He's not necessarily interested in the broader mission of counterinsurgency and bringing sustainability to this Iraqi town. And, on one hand, if I were a spouse or a parent of one of these young soldiers, what more could you want from a platoon sergeant, a leader, to say, I will bring your boy home. Right? Don't worry about it. I got this. On the other hand, that's going to come with a lot of moral compromises, particularly when that is conflicting with that higher purpose and higher mission. But he's a survivor, and I think that's something he has in common with Rana, who is a local Iraqi woman who potentially some years before was part of an ill-fated romance with an American soldier who has since gone missing in action. But by the time Jack, the narrator, finds her, she's not the beautiful, innocent sheik's daughter of legend. She's a survivor. She has two young children, and no matter what, she's going to do what it takes for the three of them to survive this war, come hell or high water. So in very different ways, I think Jack is kind of attracted to both Chambers and Rana. Because he's a cipher. This is his first tour. He has clear eyes, but he's very inexperienced. And one of the reasons I chose him as a narrator was I wanted to bring in American readers who might necessarily have any connection to these wars and can identify with that. I know what the right thing to do is in theory, but now this is very morally complex, and if you make this decision because that's what the army is telling you to do, these people will suffer. But if you make the humanist choice, there's going to be all kinds of consequences as well, not just institutionally, but on these other group of people, right? Kind of having Rana and Chambers be similar but so distinct in their goals and purposes, and having Jack kind of vacillate between the two of them, I thought it would be indicative of maybe some of the broader dilemmas faced by American soldiers and Iraqis in that war, and just kind of the nature of counterinsurgency, right? Is very conflicting. Bringing arms humanitarianism is a term, which is itself a dichotomy, or can be. And then also, it's a novel, so story first, story always. I thought it would just be interesting. I wanted people to read this book and be interested, and then maybe think about some of this broader stuff. But if they're not reading, if they're not interested in the story, they're not going to care about the bigger stuff either.
Right. Now, I know not all veterans or military will necessarily agree with what you think are the moral and ethical dilemmas, but you just mentioned a couple, but would you be willing to share a few more that you see from your point of view of when someone is inhabiting those boots on the ground, Lou was really helpful when she says she always thinks of, they're not just boots on the ground, they're people who are in these boots on the ground. So these people, what sort of moral and ethical dilemmas you see they face?
Sure. There's a scene where a group of American soldiers and Iraqi soldiers are stranded at the top of a mosque. It's near the end of the book, and this mosque is 700 years old. It's the centerpiece of this town, but insurgents have occupied the top of it, right? And what do you do in this position? Like how do you bring them down? There's something similar happened in 2004 in the real Iraq, not the Iraq and Youngblood, with Muqtada al-Sadr in Najaf, right? And what happened there was by the time it got out to the media and to the generals, they knew you can't destroy an ancient mosque, even if this guy and the people up there have American blood on their hands. Our insurgent leaders have helped initiate this civil war. So by kind of, and I have the characters in the scene of this one cite that and be like, so we can't do that. We know that's the wrong thing to do because Sadr came down, was essentially given immunity, and then went back to leading the Shia insurgency. And yet, I don't think it's too much of a spoiler to say just because they know not to do that doesn't mean that they figure out a different wrong way to carry this out, which to me it kind of felt indicative of not just the Iraq War, but perhaps a lot of American foreign policy of the 21st century is it's not so much that you're making the same mistakes from history, but you're learning the wrong things, interpreting the wrong things from history. As Mark Twain famously said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And that was something as I was writing and rewriting this book, employing different scenes and maybe making obvious or oblique references to the past that I kept in mind. Usually people are trying to figure out the smart, right thing to do. But what happens when it's there? That is not an option. It's the only option is figuring out the least wrong thing to do and the least stupid thing to do. What does that look like? Not just in the moment, but how does that linger and resonate? In many ways, 2010, 2011, when it set, the fallout from the violence that took place in 2006 in the sectarian wars, where Rana and Chambers and Shaba, the mythical American soldier missing in action, that is only now coming out to bear the consequences and the effects of that in 2010, 2011. And for me, that served as, or I was aiming for it to serve as a microcosm for the wars as a whole.
Mm-hmm. So this means that you, as well as other people who have served, who have had these sort of been in a position of having moral and ethical dilemmas, and you've even stated yourself, you went in and you felt you left the place better than when you and the military had come in. So you're proud of your military service, yet it sounds like you're put in really difficult situations to make tough decisions, which sometimes you feel it's the least bad one to do. So when you come back here and you're in America, and somebody walks up to you on the street, they hear you're a veteran, they say, Matt, thank you for your service. Mm-hmm. And veterans have very different responses to this. Would you share yours and then any other thoughts you'd like to say about that comment?
Sure. The first couple years when I got back, I was probably like a lot of recently returned vets and not angry about that, but resented it because you interpret it as maybe a shallow drive-by, right? As not a real effort at real connection, but thinking that it has less to do with me or my service or service members as a whole, and more to do with some kind of civilian issue that this person is trying to absolve themselves of. With time, I've found that more often than not, that statement is coming from a very earnest and sincere place. They just don't know what else to say, given the litany of societal and cultural complications of military service in contemporary America. So I try, and some days are better than others, to as long as that is a start of something, as an opening, right? Like to thank them for coming up, and then, you know, maybe just having a couple minute conversation, or asking about, do you have any friends in the service, maybe, or maybe the kid down the street that you think about, figuring out what implored them to come up in the first place, or trying to, and in that way you're not just establishing a personal connection, I think, but you're, we're all in this, right? Like we're all connected to this idea of a citizenry being connected to its military, even indirectly. I think is so vital, and it's something that within the veterans community is an ongoing conversation, and realizing that just because you're out, whether you like it or not, you are going to function as an ambassador for this world, and you can either do it as a kind of angry caricature, or you can do it as a approachable, informed citizen, right? That is willing to meet people halfway. But easy to do in practice or in theory. And on the first to admit, it took me a couple years to try even get there, to even try to be that person. But I did it because I saw other veterans of different eras, Vietnam, Persian Gulf, Iraq, and Afghanistan, doing that and being like, I want to be like that person. I don't want to be like that person. I want to be like that. And trying to employ that in my day-to-day life as much as possible.
And I think it's a beautiful way. You're basically saying, with that small statement of somebody saying thank you for your service, you're trying to bridge that divide between the military and America that you were speaking about. I'm just looking at the time and would like to open it up to the rest of you for any questions you might have for Matt. And on anything. As you've seen, we've covered quite a few topics. There are people in here who may be budding writers, divinity students. Anything about religion is, yes, Sunny.
Hi, I was just wondering, and I realize you're talking about Youngblood, but what would the next book focus on, and what perspective would you write from?
Sure. It won't be about Iraq. I can promise you that. For I think a couple different reasons. One, I think no human being likes being pigeonholed or reduced, and I think artists are particularly sensitive about that. They're particularly sensitive about everything, myself included. So I think there's that of like, okay, I was very hesitant to write Youngblood. I was trying to write anything and everything other than the military or Iraq, but the subject wasn't done with me. Whether I liked it or not, and then there's the fact that I've written a novel, a memoir, contributed a short story to a collection that I edited. I have nothing left to say on the subject, at least now. I mean, that's not to say 20, 30 years down the road, maybe I won't return to it. But there's just there's other things I want to write about, and I have a draft of a novel that's in very rough shape, and it needs a lot of work, but I'm excited by its potential. That I think in many ways Youngblood is kind of about post-Empire America written from the fringe. I think this one is about the same thing, but written from the center of it, even if it doesn't necessarily directly deal with the military. I'd tell you more, but honestly it's just going to change. But yeah, I mean, it's something that I think it's an ongoing conversation in the small veteran writer group scene, whatever you want to say. You can either, what do you want to do? And it's really what you want to write next. It's a choice. I mean, you can be like James Salter, who came back from Korea and wrote one beautiful novel about Korea called The Hunters, and then he wrote about all kinds of other stuff. I mean, that book really isn't what he's best known for at all. Or you can be like Tim O'Brien, who has written wonderfully and beautifully about Vietnam over and over again. You can almost feel it when you compare those texts, him kind of recircling it and trying to get it as exactly correct as possible. and thank God, right? Because every time he does it, it's unique and sharper and resonant. But we'll see. But I think I'd prefer to go the more salter route. But best laid plans of mice and men, you know. Yeah.
So I don't know if this is accurate, but I hear some tones maybe of some David O. Russell in there, and maybe a little bit of Three Kings. And I wonder if it's fair. Do you think there is a connection with that kind of era of storytelling and what you're trying to do, or are they different?
Can it be both? I know that's like a writerly dodge, but yeah, I mean, I think all literature, but in particular, war literature, American war literature has a very specific tradition, right? I mean, we're all Stephen Crane's shadow is cast over all of us, even though Hemingway tried to kind of reappropriate much of Crane's technique and style as his own, and did so wonderfully. Like many people, I find Hemingway's work astounding. But it's also got to be its own thing, right? Like you couldn't write Vietnam in the desert. O'Brien came up. You couldn't write a story about a 19-year-old draftee from Minnesota who just ends up in Iraq, right? No, I mean at some point, like we volunteered, right? So what does that mean? Not just for the person who volunteered, or the local people who are interacting with an all-volunteer force. What does it mean for the citizenry back home, for the Republic? That's worth exploring. Having kind of full, well-rounded local characters, the enemy, the other, is something that I think is really interesting that's happening in contemporary war literature. Elliot Ackerman wrote his novel from the perspective of an Afghan militant, which is, and he does it and he pulls it off. I think you'd really have to go back to kind of World War I literature to kind of have this kind of same kind of consideration for the other side, which is really interesting. And then something that I realized, I don't even know if I was conscious of when I was in the Army, but as I was writing this, kind of a self-consciousness of being in uniform now, right? Because of you grow up with all these movies, all these books, right? There's a line in here: "We were what we pretended to be," right? And because all these different narrative shadows that you're dealing with. World War II, the grand narrative of saving democracy and pushing back fascism, right? It seems very quaint now, but 9/11 happened. I was a freshman in college. It felt like what we thought Pearl Harbor would have felt like. Obviously, things have not played out that way at all. Being people about my age, our parents were of the Vietnam generation, right? So maybe they went over there and served. Maybe they protested like my parents did, but they considered it was a formative part of their youth, right? And then just growing up and considering those two different things, and then movies like Apocalypse Now or Full Metal Jacket that are such a fixed part of not just American culture, but American cultural interpretation of what war is and what war is like, and then realizing you have that moment where you realize Full Metal Jacket is a stridently anti-war film, right? Yet every soldier and Marine I knew could quote it verbatim, and in some cases may have joined up partly because of that movie. I mean, what is I don't necessarily have an answer for that, but I find that cultural reappropriation fascinating, right? So, what does it mean? I don't know. It's certainly something worth exploring in the literature of contemporary armed conflict, because there is there's another scene in here where, in the midst of a firefight, they don't know what to do because the manuals they've read don't have an answer for it. But they saw an episode of Band of Brothers that they borrow from. They're like, oh, let's just do that. That would work, which is of course based off of an actual battle. So it's life imitating art, imitating life. I don't know. It felt it felt intellectually honest and also emotionally truthful to the service of the American service of the 21st century.
I think you said you don't have an answer to the question that I had in my head, but you mentioned in terms of reappropriation, cultural reappropriation. It fascinates me that a lot of vet writers seem highly critical of war, and there's this danger of no matter what you write, you glorify war.
Sure.
And it seems to be some kind of appropriation, not even by individual human beings, but culturally, there seems to be this just push to violence or whatever, that no matter how we read it, or no matter how we write it, it's going to be read in a certain way. And I'm wondering, what do you think of writing it? That some kid may pick that up and think, yeah, this time, I don't know, whatever else got bombed, and we're going to go kill the bad guys. That may not be your message, but that's how they receive it.
Right.
Tertiary or secondary question is between fiction and nonfiction. You've written both, and I've always been kind of, I don't know what to do with that distinction. So Band of Brothers was written by a civilian, maybe very well, but I'm still, something makes me nervous about that. So Phil Clyde writing in other people's perspective, from a perspective that he, to an extent, shared. And to what extent can we write the story from another perspective and it be reliable and credible?
Sure.
And then also, if we're even writing our own story, credibly, reliably, authoritatively, how it can still be interpreted however someone wants.
Yeah.
I mean, that may be too big a question, I'm sorry.
No, I mean, the best questions are the big questions.
Maybe that hasn't kept you from writing. What inspired you to write finally, knowing that someone could take that and do whatever they want with it?
So I think I'll start with kind of the war story consciousness part of the question. Yeah, it's something you consider, and I had an essay a few months ago for the Paris Review that essentially talked about me joining ROTC because of For Whom the Bell Tolls, right? And I don't know if there's a pro-war message in that book, but it's certainly not an anti-war message. Vonnegut had the famous quote, how do you write an anti-war book? You might as well write an anti-glacier book. This was before climate change was a big thing, so I don't know how well that explanation will age. Our kids might not get it because they won't have glaciers. But you consider it. You don't. I mean, for me, the compromise. I wanted this to be a book not about armed violence, but about the after effects and consequences of armed violence. As a result, I think there's 3 war scenes in here, but that's probably a total of 20 pages in a 320-page book. For me, that felt important for these reasons, and I didn't want to do what another vet writer coined. Brian Van Riet wrote a great essay for the New York Times called "The Kill Memoir." I think there was this book called Carnivore coming out about the American tanker who had killed the most people in the war. That's an obvious example of kind of the glorification aspect of it. But you're absolutely right. There might be a young mind that will pick this up and maybe join up as a result. On one hand, that's a little intimidating and disturbing. On the other hand, if somebody's inspired by literary fiction to do anything, is that a bad thing? I don't know. I know as a citizen now, I want young idealistic people wearing the uniform, right? Who are going to read books, who are going to seek out consideration and have empathy for the wider world. I also want them to be very good at doing army things as well. And then there's just the alternative of not writing from writing about it is not writing about it. And I don't think ignorance of any subject is the answer, right? You want to do it thoughtfully and have nuance and complexity and ambiguity, and then hopefully on top of that do it well. but if would the world be a better place without anyone writing about Iraq or Afghanistan? Maybe not. It certainly would be a less informed place, and I don't think I just can't believe that's the answer either. Let's see. As for the what was the second part of your question again?
Fiction and nonfiction.
Fiction and nonfiction, sure. Yeah, I mean, genre, like most genre labels, I think that reduces more than it clarifies. On the other hand, we're human beings and we need order, right? Like just so like when you walk into a Barnes and Noble, you know which section to go to. But is it weird that Hunter S. Thompson is in nonfiction, whereas the Nick Adams stories by Hemingway are going to be in the fiction section? Yeah, because arguably you can make a case for both those being the opposite, right? As for writing from both, I don't think this is just my trajectory. I think as a writer, I don't think it's necessarily indicative of the different genres. I found fiction much more challenging and rewarding because everything is possible. That meant that you had to be much more conscious of each part of the decision. Whereas with Kaboom, this is what happened, right? There was a built-in structure already there. But I don't think that's a universal thing. I think that was just my development as, when I wrote Kaboom, I was 24. I didn't know what I didn't know, right? I was very young and cocksure, as any 24-year-old cavalry lieutenant blogging from Iraq should be. At 32, writing Youngblood, I hope and I think I was much more conscientious and had a wider purview of it all, and God, I hope I was a better writer too. Yeah.
So I don't know if you have kids or when you have kids, would you advise your son or daughter to go into the military as a career?
We don't have kids. My wife and I do have a trainer baby, a 2-year-old Irish setter. So we have very different parenting styles, we're finding out. My wife does not approve of my sink or swim approach at the dog park. As for like all things, I think it would depend. I mentioned my parents protested, but they were also children of World War II veterans. So, my brother and I were reared with I think a healthy respect for military service, but also a skepticism for military, how and when military forces applied. So we had a lot of conversations about, because I was in ROTC and could have left, and my parents volunteered. ROTC paid for my school, but my parents did say, we'll figure out a way to pay for this if this is not what you want to do. I think I would just throw a lot of books at them, make them be like, read this, then we'll talk. And not my books, no. That would be, no matter what, as a parent, they're going to resent you, right? So forcing them to read your literature is not going to help that. I think I'd curate like a reading list for them and say, let's talk after you read all of these. And I'd want those books to have different messages and conflicting messages. And then we talk, and what's going on in the world then.
So that plays into it, what's going on in the world. Like, say you had a kid now that was, 18, and what's going on in Syria, and there's talk about putting more boots on the ground in that conflict, or putting boots on the ground. Would you recommend that based on policy, or would it just be a different kind of a decision?
If he or she...
Knowing they were going to go, say, fight in Syria. Like, if you didn't agree with the policy, would you still recommend that they go, if they were committed?
Yeah, I would, because I think it's up to us to determine that policy. Thank God we live in a country where young people are willing to fight for the collective. We need to do our damnedest to ensure that when and where they do it, it's because all other options have been exhausted. But as an individual in an institution, I don't think picking and choosing, picking and choosing that way is a beneficial thing.
Thank you for sharing. Go ahead.
Kind of ties in with what you were saying. Do you think there is a non-imperialist way to act as a soldier or fight in a war for a country to fight in a war or get involved in a conflict in any way? Myself, I got involved in Operation Enduring Freedom as a medic. Actually was attracted to the Army as a chaplain because I wasn't afraid of conflict, but I wanted to be a force for peaceful resolution to the conflict, or at least make a bad place better. Do you think there is a way to be involved in a conflict, or for the United States to, or does the United States have to stay completely out of foreign affairs?
Well,
Where does a soldier fit into that picture,
Sure. Well, for all the blunders of American foreign policy of the last 15 years, I don't think, if magically it disappeared tomorrow, the world would be a better, safer place. Certainly South Korea would have some serious consequences to deal with that. Taiwan, right? If the U.S. Navy was like, in the Pacific said, screw this, let's go to Hawaii, right? How about Liberia, right? Something I always think about when considering kind of the soldiers' role in all of this is last year two brigades from the 101st deployed, right? One went back to Iraq, the other went to Liberia, right, to help deal with the Ebola crisis. Okay, it's not like the two stars said, all right, soldiers who want to go to Liberia, you line up here. Soldiers who want to go to Iraq, you go here. No, part of the job, part of the contract, as an individual, is saying, is giving up that choice, right? And that requires a lot of requires courage or ignorance, which is what makes young people so beautiful, right? That incredible combination and contradiction. So where does the soldier fit into all of that? It's an ongoing thing, right? I'm sure I spent many days and nights in Iraq wrestling with this very thing. You control what you can control, right? You try to make your town, your platoon, your sector, a place worth coming, worth visiting, worth coming back to. And again, we're all, I think, colored by our own experiences. But say what you will about counterinsurgency, and there's a lot of more examples of it failing miserably than there are of it succeeding. But it did provide us kind of a clear, coherent purpose and goal, right? Like this was the end state to strive to. That's not always been the case, I think, these past 15 years. Certainly that's something you hear coming out of Iraq and Afghanistan, which is what is the end goal here, right? So in uniform, you have to focus on what you can control and what you cannot. And I've heard people say, well, that's an out. That's morally lazy, blah 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 blah. No, it's just because in that moment you have to do your job. You have to do your damn job. Afterwards, it sounds like many people here are doing that. You wrestle with these questions and you try to make it, shape it, and make it more exact and more purposeful for the next generation, right? And hopefully they have a clearer purpose if and when the next conflict breaks out. But I do love the dispatch song, "The General," but that's for hanging out and drinking beer. That can't be employed in practice.
I'm really glad you brought up that part of the book where Jack invokes Band of Brothers, because I had actually just pulled that up in here because there's so many things I want to say about the book, and I'm going to try not to say spoilers. But that particular part to me, what Matt does really beautifully, among many things he does really well in this book, is keep the reader sort of off kilter in terms of whether you are, like, I started this book thinking, absolutely, I'd follow Jack Porter. And then you get to this point where it's like, oh my goodness, I would not want to be in any situation with Jack Porter in charge. And this is one of those where, he's sitting there, they're getting attacked, and he's thinking, oh, what does the manual tell me to do? And nothing's coming to his head. And he goes, but then I thought of Band of Brothers, and just to me, he says to his soldiers, he says, Washington, ever see Band of Brothers when they advance on the Nazis from behind a tank? He grinned, and I reached for the radio to order Hogg to maneuver the striker between buildings. Life imitating art, imitating life, I thought. I'm a fucking postmodern boss. And that was just, I mean, you see him seeing himself. And that sort of insecurity that comes through in that, and the reason I'm bringing that up is, one, that you do this good job of kind of keeping you wondering whose side you're supposed to be on in a lot of ways in this book, and also wondering what the truth is, or where the facts are. And I was struck when you said about Kaboom. I was just writing about what was happening, because I thought, well, when I read Youngblood, one of the things that comes through in that book is how you never really know what's happening. Like, there's so many points in here where Porter thinks he's figured things out, and then some new information comes in a new context, and he goes, oh, this person I thought was my friend is really my enemy. And it's a constantly shifting terrain for him that just keeps him on edge and doubting himself and doubting everyone around him. When I read this and I think, wow, military bureaucracy is just as bad as any other. It's just, I understood more than I expected to. But then at the same time, I thought, that feels wrong to be saying that, because we have in our society this idea that the military is different, that people who are doing that are doing honorable things. And so it felt a little wrong in some ways to be saying, I get that.
Well, whether people people are going to be offended no matter what, whatever the, so you just gotta put it out there. Yeah, no, I'm glad that resonated with you that way, because the military is not a monolithic entity, right? That has kind of one coherent brain, right, or a decision-making process. It's an institution, and it's a giant institution with all kinds of bureaucratic inanities and contradictions within it. Just basic things like the NCO officer relationship, right? I remember trying to explain this to my mom one time. I was like, well, yeah, technically they call me sir, but and they salute me, but they've been in for 15 years, and they're the ones I turn to when I need help. She's like, oh, it's like my office manager, right? She's an attorney. And she's like, oh, okay, that makes sense. So you don't want to be that hotshot lawyer from Duke Law coming up and bossing the office manager around, because things will go seriously awry. I was like, yeah, that's exactly it, right? Exactly. And yes, and in a weird way, I think I was trying to use the bureaucracy, the institutional bureaucracy, to humanize it all, because it is such a foreign culture to so many Americans, but it really isn't, because it's at the end of the day, it's people that make up the institution, and they're smart people, and they're stupid people, and they're brave people, and there are bad people, and usually everyone is all of those things, right, on any given day, right? We're all smart and stupid on any given day. We're all courageous and scared on any other day. So I'm glad that part of it resonated with you. Yeah.
I see that same bullshit, higher stakes, right? But the question I have, so I did a couple tours as a civil affairs guy, so I'm well acquainted with the counterinsurgency kind of environment. And so, on the ground, you can't hardly separate people out. So I'm really curious, as a writer, when you're trying to humanize Iraqis in this case, and differentiate, maybe the insurgent versus the everyday Iraqi, but really are the two just the same thing? How do you navigate that? How do you sort it out?
Yeah, I think you have to take some narrative liberties and just kind of simplify, right? Like, it starts with having a very isolated town along the sectarian border, right? Okay, so it's kind of like, it's almost your island in the desert, all right? So you have some built-in structural things there. And then just, instead of having, being so realistic that you have 20 different Shia insurgents that you're trying to track down, you have 2, right? And so it's just, because otherwise, if you write too close to the bone, it'll just be too sprawling and too overwhelming. So it's just really kind of a matter of having kind of stand-ins function as for everyone, right? And it's just a compromise you just have to make to tell for the sake of the story.
How does faith play in, let's say, during your experience, how did faith play for you? And then the other thing, if you don't want to talk about that, because that's very personal, we have experienced during the time you were in, and everyone has seen in the media various times when people have seen this as a war between Christianity and Islam.
Mm-hmm.
So just from your perspective, would love for you to speak on any of those.
Sure. I mean, I was raised a Presbyterian. I would say my faith is an ongoing thing, better some days than others, and certainly that was the case during my own tour. Something that struck with me though over there was kind of the same thing. It's always the zealots who are seeking to polarize issues and to exploit differences, whether in this case, trying to turn it into a holy war on both sides. You saw that on both sides, and 98% of the everyday Iraqis I encountered were welcoming and said that we all worship the same God, and that part of being a Muslim for them was protecting people of the book, right, which they included Christians and Jews in, and spoke of their anger towards how extremists can so easily polarize and exploit. I mean, you see some of the stuff that ISIL puts out in the name of Allah, and no God would advocate for that. It was more, it's more kind of the social and cultural barriers that you see in the third world. So you don't necessarily get the same pushback that you do in a stable country like America with the media providing the counter push. If nothing else, I came back realizing that for all the differences we have with the Muslim world, there's infinitely more similarities, and that the people are just people trying to endure, trying to survive, trying to make the best of what they have. So
I especially appreciate that you not only speak about the very personal and emotional issues, but also that you're willing to talk about these issues that are of international politics and the things that people really do struggle with, and that you connect the two of them. And I think you do that great in your book and all of your writing, and thank you for also doing it here today.
Oh, well, thanks so much for having me. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you.
Produced by Duke University, online at duke.edu.